After more than a month of mounting tension and escalation in the Middle East, the situation remains ambiguous. The United States is ramping up its military presence with aircraft carriers like the USS George H.W. Bush moving into the region, even as President Donald Trump signals a possible withdrawal within weeks and raises questions about the NATO itself. At the same time, Europe is stepping in diplomatically without Washington. Tensions are rising around the Strait of Hormuz, and conflicting narratives are deepening uncertainty. Iran says US claims to have held direct talks with them are baseless. So where is all of this heading? To answer this question, we'll be joined with a panel of guests in just a moment. To start our discussion, let's welcome Todd Shepard, Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University, joining us live from New York.
Greetings.
Thank you for joining us, Mr. Todd.
Thank you, Miriam.
Also joining us is Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean of International Education and Senior International Officer at California State University, joining us live from California. Thank you, Mr. Salhi.
Thank you, Miriam, and a pleasure being with Todd on this program.
Thank you very much. Also, Akram Khriyef, security and geostrategy expert, answered some of our questions earlier from Tunis. And maybe to begin with the military picture and the picture on the ground, Dr. Akram Khriyef, a specialist in defense and security, answered our question on President Trump's hints at considering withdrawing the US from NATO, the deployment of multiple aircraft carriers in the region, talking about leaving quickly as well. Here is his take on all of this.
President Donald Trump is threatening to leave NATO. He is threatening his allies with this very dark perspective for them. NATO is providing a security umbrella for the almost all the European states and also other states in the Baltics against especially Russia. Donald Trump considers that the majority of those countries are not contributing enough. So this is a good pretext for Donald Trump to withdraw from NATO or at least kind of blackmail European countries into giving more money to the United States in order to keep or to buy this security umbrella. The consequence of that, of course, benefits to Russia. Russia is dreaming about this situation since now ages, since more than 50 years. They want a NATO-free Europe, and they don't want to have NATO at their border. So if this threat is realized by the US president, this will completely suit Russia and probably also weakens the power of some European countries. So we will probably see new alliances within the EU, and also a kind of race, arms race between especially France and Germany.
Professor Todd Shepard, with Trump signaling both potential NATO withdrawal and a quick exit from the Middle East, perhaps within weeks, as he said, what does this say about the current state of Western hegemony? And are we witnessing cracks in the traditional global power order?
Oh, yes, we are. Part of this is simply one person who is not interested in the past or the future and is purely thinking in the present, changing hour by hour the plans with no seeming ability to have predicted anything, some profounded capacity to rely on experts or counselors that could give him information that he could grapple with in ways that would allow a type of coherent plan to move forward. So there's that. There's this singular chaos factor of Donald Trump, but there's also a larger set of issues, which I think Akram Kref really brought out clearly. The United States doesn't have, or has not articulated clearly to its people, at the very least, why it is involved in NATO. There are many reasons to think that it causes problems. There are many other reasons to think that it's got very positive aspects to bring to at least American power and American interests in the world. So it's very interesting to see no kind of public discussion in and around the United States about how to debate and think about whether the United States should be connected to NATO. How is it that it's being debated right now or discussed right now in an area that's not theoretically under the control or under the responsibility of NATO, that is the Straits of Hormuz, for a war that is illegal, that was launched unilaterally by Israel and the United States together with zero consultation whatsoever. Again, here there is a process which is broken of how the President of the United States makes decisions, and therefore a larger mechanism, the cabinet, the government, the Congress, the American governmental system that is not functioning either. So this is something to observe. At the same time, people are being killed in large numbers, in particular in Lebanon, in particular in Iran, in particular in the West Bank, in particular throughout the occupied territories of Palestine, under the guise of what are the goals? We don't really know. So all of this suggests that other countries should actively look to think about their relationship with the United States, and I think everyone is. Again, your analyst really nicely pointed that out. It makes countries that were really dependent on the United States, whether that is the Emirates, the Saudis, Morocco, the Germans, etc., all of them need to ask themselves a lot of questions, and whether they can wait for a few months for the American elections, the midterms, whether they can wait until Donald Trump leaves, which in theory will happen, but they have to make decisions now. And so, yes, certainly, Western hegemony has been challenged. The incapacity of Western weapons, not only U.S. weapons, despite their incredible power and dominance in multiple kind of tactical scales, to actually achieve very much, also raises questions. So yeah, a lot to discuss.
Understood. To you, Professor Salhi, how does the perception of the U.S. leaving the NATO impacts the calculations of actors in the region like Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, or Gulf states? Does it create opportunities for non-Western powers to assert influence?
It's a tough question. Certainly, there are specific cases. I think the case of the Arab world, the Gulf countries in particular, is far different from how Europeans or Americans view NATO, or in light of President Donald Trump making statement about NATO's not helping him and not coming to his rescue from in that sense. I think for the Gulf countries, the problem is posed differently. The 6 countries of the Gulf have military pacts with the United States, and every 10 years they are renewed. And the most recent ones were in 2025. And it's signed with different countries. So it's not one treaty. The United States made a point of having separate treaties with separate countries, not a single one with the entire collectivity. In addition, the United States has major military projects or investment or buying arms, and it counts in billions to a point. So that's difficult, but the challenge for the Arab world is United States engagement in this kind of war poses its national security threat. And the biggest losers today is the region, not only in human losses, but in terms of reconstructions, investment, and so on and so forth. So for them, there will be a serious discussion about reviewing this kind of relationship. As far as NATO, I think the last time Donald Trump has been successful in putting pressure by making this kind of statement on Europeans to spend more, to contribute more to the NATO. Surely it would have been great if they lend their support, but they didn't, and as a result, he's making this kind of statement. I certainly don't see United States or Europe breaking this alliance. I think it makes good for a narrative, particularly at this time. Getting out of NATO would require 2/3 of the Senate members. It would require a lot of things to do before the United States is out.
Professor Todd, Britain is hosting talks with 35 countries on the Strait of Hormuz without the United States at the table. Does that suggest Washington's military role is now so central that other powers are trying to build a diplomatic track around it rather than through it?
Well, we just learned just a few minutes ago that in the middle of March, Trump threatened to cut off all support for the mechanism that sends U.S. arms to Ukraine. The United States isn't even paying for these arms. The Europeans are paying for them. So his threat was if the Europeans, his allies, the United States' his allies, did not immediately help open the Straits of Hormuz, they would cut off sending military weapons to this Pearl grouping that uses European funds to purchase American weapons to send to Ukraine. So they've kind of scrambled to come up with a fig leaf, right? So they're doing all sorts of things. I think everyone's dealing with at very least two levels. How do you manipulate public relations with the President of the United States, which primarily involves seemingly TV declarations and gesturing in ways that capture his attention in the brief moment when he's focused. And then trying to figure out things that they need. And clearly the world, or certainly European powers, need the Straits of Hormuz to be opened up. So yeah, they're clearly coming up with a set of mechanisms. Britain is moving, I think, more aggressively to reconnect in key ways with Europe. Finally, 10 years after Brexit, finally under a government that is explicitly critical of Brexit and was composed of people that were against Brexit, Britain's departure from the European Union. So this situation has pushed them back towards Europe and made them able to say that more clearly. Whether or not other types of cooperation work out, or whether, as your analyst really pointed out with his suggestion, Akram Kref, that France and Germany, the tensions between them, the differences in points of view, he suggested maybe even an arms race between the two. I don't necessarily see that, but it really puts the finger on something important, that the kind of status quo, the over 50 years of NATO, has certainly gelled the ways that countries think about their relationships with each other. And as you point out, they're having to rethink that dramatically in new ways right now, with what they need, oil and supplies that go through the Straits of Hormuz, and what they thought they had, which was U.S. support, which cannot be trusted clearly at this point.
Understood. Professor Salhi, if London and Paris are taking the lead on Hormuz diplomacy while the US stays outside the room, are we seeing the emergence of a European-led crisis management track separate from the American war strategy?
You could say that, but in reality, what we've seen from the major powers in Europe is that they cannot act without relying on the United States or the United States leading them. These are positions are good for public relations, I believe. They are in line with the public sentiment in their respective countries. But to what extent they can take Europe to be independent of the United States, or to go simply against the United States, we are far from that. And we've seen this on multiple occasions, where one of the issues that came out of the Ukraine is the European security. Well, you have within the European Union, the Organization of European Security, and that security is supposed to lead Europe, but it hasn't been sort of empowered to take the lead in handling matters that involve Europe. In addition, within the NATO, we've seen throughout these decades is that the shaping of NATO has been sort of more of the shaping of Europe has been more led by the United States than Europe. The expansion of the NATO mission after the end of the Cold War, it was sort of designated at the time that Islamists, that NATO's role after the collapse of the Cold War and the former Soviet Union, that the mission of NATO will be anti or against Islamic movement or Islamist movement specifically, and that shaped it until later on, where China and Russia became a threat. But in the case that we have seen, NATO intervention or participation in Afghanistan is beyond the boundaries that were set for NATO to exist. Its involvement in Libya is another indicator that the policies of NATO were most likely and most of the time led by the US, or at least with the acceptance of the United States. The last point is that what we've seen European leaders take positions, and they are different from, if they are different from the United States, they don't lead to a level where they are united under one specific agendas, and that would put pressure on the United States. The current crisis in Ukraine is a clear example of that. Certainly, there are divisions within Europe. There are a sort of dismay at how the Americans are handling that conflict. But in no point we've seen, other than visit by separate leaders to Washington, that level of resistance, those statements like France is making, or the French leader is making, raised to the level where they rally other countries behind them. And that's really the biggest challenge. So from that perspective, what I see is more of the declaration to meet or to the sentiment, or to show to the citizen of their countries or the population of their countries that they are doing something. And in reality, that hasn't mounted yet to serious changing or leading Europe without the United States leadership.
Mr. Khreyev also talked about the Strait of Hormuz and said that it is central to the conflict. Let's perhaps listen to his take on the Strait of Hormuz importance.
Unlocking the Strait of Hormuz is becoming, for Donald Trump and the United States Army, one of the key elements of this war. It was an outcome that was not that expected from the United States, or at least they thought at the beginning that a blockade would be temporary and would be faced by an intensive strike from the US to unlock the strait. It looks like the Hormuz Strait is now completely under a new configuration, with a new route for merchant ships and tankers that now have to pass through the Iranian waterways, and cannot have this direct exit anymore from the Gulf. So it means that Iran is sanctuarizing this region and is becoming the only player that is able to allow or prevent any merchant ship to go from the Gulf, the Perso-Arabic Gulf to the Sea of Oman. And this is very, very important. United States does not have the ability yet to unblock and unlock the strait for a couple of reasons. First of all, United States cannot today, by only striking the area, unlock the strait. They also lack a complete control of Iranian skies. We have seen since the beginning of this war more than 35 drones downed by the Iranians. And also we have seen a couple of aircraft that was targeted by the Iranian air defense. So it means that the US is relying heavily on its standoff munition, which means that they have to strike Iran from within a couple of tens of kilometers distance from its border. So the lack of air control, and also the lack or the impossibility for the US Navy to go within the Gulf because of the threat of mines, drones, and missiles, makes them totally inefficient for any action against the Strait of Hormuz.
Back to you, perhaps, Professor Todd. President Trump now says the U.S. could withdraw from the war within 2 or 3 weeks, even as more American forces, including the USS George H.W. Bush carrier strike group, move into the region. Is Washington preparing for exit or simply increasing pressure before any exit becomes possible?
Again, we're talking about someone who changes his mind every day, multiple times. Certainly the arrival of a third, as you noted earlier, a third U.S. aircraft carrier. We have elite troops, we have ground troops that could be dropped in. There's other troops being sent. So there's all sorts of preparation for what would still take quite a while to build up for an actual ground invasion, but for Carg Island, for some kind of other crazy attempt. We know that the President of the United States kind of wanted to have them think about sending in commandos to extract the uranium from the site that, according to quote him, the United States in Israel, or the United States obliterated back during the 12-day war in June. So that was, I think, yesterday. So everything should be thought of as on the table. Clearly tonight, he seems to be about to announce that that the war will be ending. With proclamations of how incredibly successful it has been. I think today or yesterday he was proclaiming that the United States has already achieved 3 regime changes in Iran since the war began. So things are just being said by him to achieve what his original goal was, which was to be popular among investors, but in particular among that, and part of the American public that he thinks of as his base. And so then you have the United States as this incredibly well-armed military power that is constantly being pushed by people and interests within it, and that have positions of power within the government to use its armed forces, to use our power to exercise authority. So we thought, or some people believed, that Donald Trump had realized that was a mistake against forever wars, against keeping things so-called isolationist. He's now someone that has a strategy. Again, someone who has no interest or knowledge about anything that's happened in the past except what he remembers in his own life, and he's not interested in learning. History is not his thing, but also no interest in the future. He's not in any way predicting or thinking about how would these different aspects or choices, whether it's supposedly leaving NATO or abandoning the Straits of Hormuz to Iranian control now that they have it. We saw this incapacity to think about the future plans were analyses were presented to him saying that the Straits of Hormuz might be closed, and these were dismissed out of hand. So what happens in reality, we will see. What he will say tonight, everything indicates, is he will suggest the United States is thinking about leaving NATO, which is legally almost impossible. But they're going to perform this, that it could be possible to stoke up somebody. I'm not quite sure whom. Then he will announce that the war will end quickly. He's saying 2 to 3 weeks, so that's what we're hearing, with no plan of how this would happen, and will simply present victory as a fait accompli, despite the fact that nobody, I think anywhere, but certainly not in the United States, understands what the goals were and what has actually been achieved, except bombing a lot of people and killing people and allowing Israel to continue to exercise, armed military aggression, not just against its neighbors, but against the people living on their land under Israeli occupation.
Mr. Salhi, Trump also claims that Iran wants a ceasefire, while Tehran is publicly calling those remarks false and baseless. How important is this growing gap between public claims of diplomatic progress and the reality of direct denial from Iran itself?
I think it's a part of a public show. And Trump has shown to be a master of this. And you have to read the subtext, or you have to look at the big picture. The big picture is that there is a huge gap between what the Americans are asking of Iran, basically, which is to surrender, and what the Iranians are saying. The Iranians are saying, we don't want to ceasefire, we want the end of the war. And nobody is talking to each other. Whether, they are doing this indirectly, in hiding, through these messages, nobody knows. But it makes it good for theater. Why? Because it adds to the narrative that doesn't address the real issue. Now, what's the big picture? The big picture is you have troops, you have major deployment of American forces in the area. We have seen in the past that these are designed there for a purpose. What is the purpose? President Donald Trump needs an off-ramp, but he just cannot get out at this time because there is so much at stake. One thing, he cannot come out and say, I want something, or I won. He can declare that, but on the ground, he cannot. The American public is increasingly frustrated with this lack of direction. So what is he talking about? He's number one, making this statement to buying times and also to allow the troops to be prepared. In terms of the NATO, the European position, that's a major concern for Donald Trump. That's why we're preparing a narrative there. They don't help us. We're going to take care of ourselves. But guess what? If this war continues, the European will be sort of put in pressure. The whole world will be put in pressure on the Americans, specifically because of the oil prices increasing and the fertilizer. So there is a major thing happening there that in the future, if this war continues. So he's creating a narrative there to establish the fact that the Europeans are not helping me. I took this, and now, it's your fault. If you helped me, we will not be in this discussion. On the Iranian negotiation, he knows very well that the Iranians have the upper hand, that putting the troops on the ground is a very, very difficult scenario. He might win something, some limited territorial. And the idea, believe me, from my reading, it's not the island of Khark or Hormuz, but it's 3 islands, Abu Musa, Greater Tamp and Lesser Tamp. Those are easy to take, and they satisfy the claim, or they will be sort of given as a prize to the United Arab Emirates for its support and the Gulf countries, because it's island that were claimed or that have been claimed by the UAE. So that's the price for that. So the point here is very, very clever how he's maneuvering this. We are focusing today more on his narrative than asking ourselves, when are those troops? How come the 82nd now just deployed another 3,000 there?
Thank you very much. We have to end. Being told that our time is over. Thank you very much for your insights, Professor Hamoud Salhi, and also Professor Totshapper. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you for accepting our invite.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to
Thank
speak to
you,
both.
gentlemen. Also, thanks to Akram Khreyev, who also joined us or gave us his insights from Tunis. And thank you, dear viewers, for your kind attention. And see you in our next editions.